Hi, my name is Joanna Whitney. I'm an intuitive artist and a student of natural law. And as a student of natural law, I'm interested in how to promote freedom in groups of people. Because what I've noticed is that in the freedom movement that I'm involved with, we have a lot of trouble supporting each other's creative individuality and dealing with conflict due to our being trained by the Prussian education system to create mini tyrannies. So I'm investigating formal consensus as a way to promote individual freedom and servant leadership of each individual member of the group. Since natural law is non-man-made laws, principles that are inherent to Earth that govern the behavior of beings who have the ability to know right from wrong, I see this as parallel. So right now I'm on page 37, and I'm going through the roles of the different characters in a formal consensus discussion, and I'm at the Peacekeeper role. The role of Peacekeeper is most useful in large groups or when very touchy, controversial topics are being discussed. A person who is willing to remain somewhat aloof and is not personally invested in the content of the discussion would be a good candidate for Peacekeeper. This person is selected without discussion by all present at the beginning of the meeting. If no one wants this role, or if no one can be selected without objection, proceed without one, recognizing that the facilitator's job will most likely be more difficult. This task entails paying attention to the overall mood or tone of the meeting. When tensions increase dramatically and angers flare out of control, the Peacekeeper interrupts briefly to remind the group of its common goals and commitment to cooperation. The most common way to accomplish this is a call for a few moments of silence. The Peacekeeper is the only person with prior permission to interrupt a speaker or speak without first being recognized by the facilitator. Also, it is important to note that the Peacekeeper's comments are always directed at the whole group, never at one individual or small group within the larger group. Keep comments short and to the point. The Peacekeeper may always, of course, point out when the group did something well. People always like to be acknowledged for positive behavior. So this is very enlightening role, especially because you might need a peacekeeper when controversial topics are being discussed. And I think we are discussing controversial topics right now. Like almost every topic that we bring up is controversial in one respect or another. Even our agendas are controversial because I think many of us don't realize what is important in our agendas. And so some people like to be the bearer of bad news and bring up extremely controversial topics. Some people want to throw a grenade in the center of the group and see what happens. Some people are unhealed from the trauma of what we've just been through, and they want help, or they're addicted to adrenaline, and they maybe want attention but don't know it, and so they bring up topics that are very offensive to the rest of the group. And just the idea that there would be a peacekeeper that would be able to interrupt, to keep things on track, help the facilitator. Because I think, right now, like, there's a lot of different things going on in our groups. Like, I think some of our groups are maybe produced by people who maybe have good intentions, but they have a subconscious drive for attention and maybe don't have the unity of the group at heart. I've just saw a group just totally fall apart because it seemed like one person who started it really didn't want to see it succeed, because what they really wanted was accolades for having started such a group. And how I know that is just because they weren't willing to get everyone's input. They just wanted to direct other people to do what they thought should be done. And it completely fell apart. First of all, they had a very successful initial meeting. And then the second time they met, I think they were flying on the coattails of their first successful meeting, and they just assumed the second meeting was going to be fine, and they didn't show up with the same jubilance as they had in the first meeting. And then they succumbed to the whims of the people who showed up without being prepared, and they changed the entire intention of the original group. So this brings up like a few points that aren't mentioned in here so far that I'm aware of. The idea of carpet bagging, which is when one group of people sets forth an agenda and then they don't show up for whatever reason, which these days I think they think that they don't, oh, if I don't show up, somebody else will. But then when that whole group doesn't show up and then other people show up, maybe the skeleton of the original group is there, but they just don't acknowledge the original purpose of the meeting, and they let the new people change the entire purpose of the meeting. And in so doing, what they're doing is they're validating the new people's agenda. And in a way, what they're enabling these new people to be carpetbaggers, which what the skeleton group should do is they should carry forward the conscience of the original group, even if those people aren't there. And that shouldn't go on forever, because if those people never come back, then they could change the original purpose of the group if the new people continue to show up. But to change the group agenda just based on the whims of people who showed up who weren't participating, it just basically means that the whole group is going to erode into nothing. And just because the new people show up and try to make an agenda doesn't mean that they're going to show up again. It basically is reflective of the intention of the original skeleton crew of the original group, that it wasn't serious, or it wasn't really about what it said it was about, because they didn't make that extra effort that was necessary to meet the opposing force. So there's a law. Once you initiate an action, it's like a wave in the ocean is the initial action. And then the next action is an opposing force, which could like crash the initial action if the initial action isn't prepared for the second force. But if the initial force is prepared, then the second force strengthens the initial force so that it becomes a wave that crashes on the beach. So, I mean, I've seen this many times where the initial workshop or the initial meeting is a great success. And then the next meeting, everybody takes for granted that the second meeting is going to be better than the first meeting. And so they don't make that extra effort that they made, or they presume things that they didn't presume in the first meeting where they showed up and gave it their all. And what happens is that second force clobbers the initial force, and it just dies. So the thing is that with regards to the peacekeeper role, it's bringing up these things. Like, you wouldn't need a peacekeeper if everyone was on purpose. I mean, they're saying here that the peacekeeper's job would be to remind the group about their unity of purpose. Because if they're bringing up, because when you bring up controversial topics, all kinds of things happen when controversial topics are brought up. It can bring up the desire to be the center of attention and throw you off from your unity of purpose because suddenly you're getting this attention. So the peacekeeper role is there to remind people of the unity of purpose of the group. And if there isn't a peacekeeper, then the facilitator's job is going to be more difficult. I've also seen this, like I mentioned this, I think in the last video, that I was in a workshop where there was a very disruptive person who basically should have had their own class, and they kept trying to derail the facilitator, and the facilitator was not really prepared for this type of situation because they were new at giving the class, and so they didn't know how to put down that disruptive person, and this would be the peacekeeper's job. When tensions increase dramatically and angers flare out of control, the peacekeeper interrupts briefly to remind the group of their goals and commitment to cooperation. The peacekeeper is the only person with prior permission to interrupt. There's, like I said, sometimes there's people who just cannot control themselves, and they think that what they have to say is more important than anyone else's input, including the facilitator. And so they interrupt constantly. And so the peacekeeper's job would be to keep them on track and, even put them in timeout. If someone cannot stop interrupting, this is like, nursery school. They could be reminded that they needed to be quiet, and they could be reminded like 3 times. And if after the 3rd time they still can't quit interrupting, they could be asked to leave the meeting and wait and come back when they had settled down and were able to be respectful of everyone else. Because one person is equal to all the other people in a group of freedom-minded people who are trying to learn something or find a solution or find an agenda, find priorities. One person does not know the truth for everyone else because it's not a tyranny. It's up to the group to discuss and find the answer together. And the thing about it is, what I've seen happen is that if the group is committed to cooperation, the spirit of all of the people, which is greater than the sum of its parts, will enter into the group, and intuitively, it will become like an intuitive force that will guide the group to find the best answer or the best priority list or whatever that would never have been able to have been devised by one person with their agenda. Okay, the next one is the advocate. Like the peacekeeper, advocates are selected without discussion at the beginning of the meeting. If because of strong emotions, someone is unable to be understood, the advocate is called upon to help. The advocate would interrupt the meeting and invite the individual to literally step outside the meeting for some one-on-one discussion. An upset person can talk to someone with whom they feel comfortable. This often helps them make clear what the concern is and how it relates to the best interest of the group. Assume the individual is acting in good faith. Assume the concern is in the best interest of the group. While they are doing this, everyone else might take a short break or continue with other agenda items. When they return the meeting after completing the current agenda item, hears from the advocate. The intent here is the presentation of the concern by the advocate rather than the upset person, so the other group members might hear it without the emotional charge. This procedure is a last resort, to be used only when emotions are out of control and the person feels unable to successfully express an idea. So this is another, amazing idea that there would be someone who is an advocate there to help someone who gets very upset and then present their idea calmly to the rest of the group. I mean, it points out that these things can happen and that these things can be supported by the group rather than shut down and shunned. Recently, I have had some experience where I'm a member of a group that has certain principles, and those principles were being violated and have been being violated for yet many years, honestly. And I was filled with the ability to stand up for those principles. And it seemed very disruptive. However, it had gotten so out of hand that it had to be done. And what's happened in that group is that it's become clear that no one cares about the principles. And so I have kind of been ostracized for doing what I did. And there was none of these roles present in that group. It was basically like extreme groupthink that was going on in that group. And one day, about 2 months ago, a small subset of the group took over and derailed the group into a sub agenda. that was so far away from the principles of the group that it basically was setting the stage for the group to be completely off the rails forever if someone didn't step up. And a friend of mine and I just discussed it outside the group. And I guess what I would say is I prayed a lot. Because I've used in the past, I have succumbed to groupthink, which I think a lot of us may have experienced this, where you know that something's wrong with what's going on, but you just literally don't have the power to speak up because the all pervasive feeling of the group is fear. Fear. I would say fear is basically what it is, because of how we've been mind controlled into leaving the authority up to the leader of the group, like the person standing in the front of the room, or some rules that we've made. But if we stop following the rules that we've made, at some point, someone has to speak up. So what happened in this situation was that I went home and I prayed for many hours. I just sat and prayed for many hours, and I asked for the power to speak up in that group because I knew someone had to, and I just had a feeling it was going to have to be me because I knew what the principles were that the group was supposed to be following, their main constitution, the one, the principles that we discussed earlier. I knew what the main principles were, but nobody else really did know, it seemed like, or they had gotten so far off track that they had forgotten about that. And they have these rules, like they have the way that the group is run. There's really no way to get it back on track because there's no advocate and there's no peacekeeper in this particular scenario. And but it is possible for the whole thing to erode, and that's what was happening. So yeah, I just started to stand up for the principles. And it wasn't taken that well, honestly. There was a few, it was and it wasn't, some people who agree with the original principles were grateful and they started gaining confidence to also speak up. While other people who have been comfortable with things as they are, the status quo, were furious that I was doing this. And it was pretty interesting, I have to say. I think it's time now. I've done my part. It was about 3 weeks of my doing this. And now I'm done, because now what I see in that group is that the original constitution of that group was made by other people, and these people who are now attending are what I would call squatters. They're people that have come into an empty building that was left, and they've taken it over, and they don't care about the original intention of the group. And so I would have to start my own group, basically, if I was going to find a principled group. And that's what this is about. This is the kind of situations, as the other situation that I was talking about, where the first meeting was quite successful in a certain way, but the second meeting died. That was because that group did not have a constitution. It did not have principles. So when the people, the majority of the people from the original decision-making body did not show up, there was nothing to fall back on. There was no principles to fall back on. And it was revealed that the original people who had brought that group together were relying more on their personalities and wanting to have accolades than they were serious about carrying forward the intention of the group itself. And so it's definitely, I'm curious to see what happens. There's going to be another meeting of that this weekend, and I'm curious to see if it completely falls apart or if it's derailed completely. So what I've learned from that, from these different experiences, is that it is very, very important to have a constitution and have people that are committed to that constitution, that have come up with it, and who understand that there's going to be a second force after you initiate the primary intention. There's going to be a second force that comes to either strengthen or quash the intention. And you have to be ready for that. And you can't just go on vacation after your initial success. You have to continue to, like I said, you have to kind of make that initial intention bigger to overcome and compensate for that second force so that the wave actually succeeds. So I think that's going to be all I talk about tonight, because this is getting a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. But what's also interesting is just to note that there are so many roles in a formal consensus meeting, which shows the commitment that each person has to successfully experience and participate in a formal consensus decision-making process, which, again, I will just add, what that does is it underscores my feeling that any kind of group decision is a spiritual experience. And if everyone is committed, then it can be greater than the sum of its parts and become really something that a group looks forward to.